It seems like as we've been going through this passage of Acts, things have just slowed down. Well, that does kind of reflect the fact that we are going through a legal proceeding here. The difference is that a lot of the delay is not due to lawyers trying to do argument, counter-argument, and making motions and doing weird things. In the biggest case, it was a corrupt official waiting for a bribe. But in our study, we haven't really delved too deeply in what is happening in Judea, in Jerusalem, in the entire area at this point in time. We've kind of glossed over a little bit that there's always a little anti-Semitism under the surface within the Roman Empire. But in order to understand Acts 25 and 26, we got to understand there's a lot more going on, especially in Jerusalem, especially here in Judea, in the Holy Land as we call it now. Understanding the politics of this time period, which is about AD 59-60. Okay, so we're looking about almost 30 years after Christ died and rose again, and the church is growing, as we know. It's not just among Jews, but among the Gentiles. And so far things have been going okay. Yeah, most of the persecution of the church has been from the Jews. And the Romans overall have pretty much supported the Christians. They just viewed Christianity as just another one of a variation of Judaism. Therefore, it was a legal religion. You could practice it. And as we saw earlier on, it was officially given this sanction. A precedent was set. But things are going to change pretty quickly. And we're not quite to the cusp of the change, but it isn't going to take much more time. Because at this point in time, Nero, yes, the infamous Nero, had been emperor in Rome for about 5 years. Now, at this point in his reign, he was actually pretty steady. Okay? He let the Jews do their thing. He honored those laws that allowed the Jews to practice their religion. And he also recognized Christianity as a part of Judaism. But here's the problem. A lot of his officials weren't quite so honorable. We already saw last time the former governor of Judea, Felix. And part of his problem was not just corruption. People would try to buy him off. But he really didn't know how to rule Judea. Okay, period. And to be honest, he didn't care. He was a Roman, and remember, he was a slave originally, so he tended to treat people like he was treated as a slave. He used very, very heavy-handed tactics when putting down even minor issues. Okay, yeah, it's one thing when you've got a rebellion taking out. Yeah, you got to put that rebellion down. But if someone insults a Roman soldier, you don't go out and kill 100 people. Okay? And this is a sample of things that Felix would do. And as a result, the political situation in Judea was growing worse and worse and worse. And that was part of the reason why Felix was recalled to Rome by Nero, is because the province was on the verge of rebellion. Now, he knew this not just from his governor, and I'm sure the governor kind of glossed over it, but there were people all over that area that reported to Rome what was happening. Not snitches per se, but concerned citizens. I mean, let's think about it. You don't like the way something is going on in your state, you write a letter to the governor, or you write a letter to a state legislator, or somebody like that. And there were people who looked at it the same way. There were Roman citizens that lived in Judea, and they basically wrote back and made a report to the empire and says, look, this is bad. And the governor's not doing anything to help the issue. So Nero recalls his governor, and he sends out a man by the name of Porcius Festus. And we'll talk about him in a second, but when he came out, a new splinter group of the Zealots. Remember, we talked about the Zealots a while back. They were very much into the violent overthrow of Roman government. Okay, they were against the Romans. They wanted to replace it with a new monarchy, if they could find someone to be king. But there was a splinter group called the Sicarii. And these guys, from them, the term cloak and dagger comes from. Because they were assassins, essentially. And they carried these small little knives or daggers that were curved, and they wore them under their cloaks. Cloak, dagger. And their MO was to go around to either Romans or Roman sympathizers. And it didn't matter if they were truly Roman sympathizers or that they thought they were. They would just basically come walking by like they were minding their own business, come along, draw the dagger, stab whoever their target was, put the dagger back, and then in the chaos that followed, they just slip out and get away. Because usually no one saw it happen. Okay? So that's a cloak and dagger operation, which is an official term. And that's exactly what happened. And so now, Festus shows up, and these guys are going wild. Romans and Roman sympathizers are dying. Innocent people who had nothing to do with politics were dying simply because someone thought they were collaborating with the Romans. And while it was true that Felix did do quite a bit to capture and punish these guys, he also used them for his own ends. There was one group he paid to assassinate a high priest named Jonathan. That was the one who was high priest before Ananias, who we met last week. And this was not as closely a guarded secret as I think Felix thought it was. And so people were fed up with Felix. They were fed up with the Romans. They're basically saying, if this is an example of Roman rule, we don't want any part of it. And so Festus shows up, and he's basically there to clean things up, but to do it in such a way as not to have a rebellion outbreak. And I got news for you. It's only about another 6 years before that becomes reality. They're that close to rebellion now. Festus did manage to turn the tide for a time. Unfortunately, the poor fellow died in office after 2 years. No one knows what he died of, but a lot of Romans had contracted tuberculosis. Just that was what happened back then, and a lot of scholars think that maybe that's what did him in. He wasn't assassinated, they do know that. It's just because too many people liked him, and even the Sicarii kind of backed off and thinking, oh, this guy is actually trying to do something, but we'll talk about that later. So if you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn to Acts chapter 25, and we're going to be starting at verse 1. So this is the position, a very unenviable position that Nero sent in his new governor. And I'm sure Festus's ears were ringing with his orders from Nero. You are going to contain what is rapidly becoming an explosive situation. You will defuse what you can, but you will do nothing that will actually cause further problems. Don't throw any fuel on the fire. Contain it. Settle things down. And Festus was an honest guy. This is one thing everyone said about it. He was honest. He truly wanted to do the right thing. He truly wanted to calm things down, settle, make sure things would get settled. Keep law and order by dealing with the Sicarii. And even the Jews were not happy about these assassins because, like I said, innocent people were getting killed. But he wanted to restore peace and justice. And as I mentioned, he died 2 years into office. And I guess Nero didn't learn his lesson because the next governor out there was a man by the name of, his last name was Albinus. This guy was even worse than Felix. And like I said, that was in 64, AD 64, 2 years out from the rebellion that's going to hit in 66. Okay? And that rebellion, when it breaks out, would lead to the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70. This is not a good time. Okay, that's basically the groundbreaking things that I'm trying to tell you. This is not a good time in Judea. Things are moving toward the fulfillment of prophecy that Jesus made, When he was still alive, he said, yeah, look at the temple, it's beautiful and so forth, but not one stone is going to be standing upon another. And he was talking about what was going to happen. A lot of prophecy in the Gospels. Jesus is predicting the destruction of Jerusalem and what was going to happen. So, here we are, AD 59, Festus shows up, he takes up his duties, and he wants to do what's right, but he's discovering that Jewish politics is not an easy thing to navigate through. And there was this case of a two-year-old case of this Paul guy who still was imprisoned now. This is the second year of imprisonment by Felix. But here's a weird thing. He had no charges against him. He was under protective custody, basically. So it was interesting, and I don't know how much he knew, but it was clear Paul was a Jew who his fellow countrymen wanted to kill him, and he was a Roman citizen, and the government didn't know what to do with him. So it's quite a pickle, because being a new governor, he realized his options at this point were quite limited. If Festus released Paul, the Jews would cause trouble, because they hated Paul. Okay? If he held Paul prisoner, he'd have to explain why this Roman citizen was being detained with no official charges and being detained this long. Okay? And Festus knew he had to act fast. So I have to do something here. I don't know what. I have to do something. And I have to take advantage of the fact that I'm a newcomer and I can do things and they can be passed off as inexperience. Okay? He was pretty savvy. So he knew that he had to delay. If he delayed, it would make the problem worse. And looking around, a lot of people were thinking, Paul being in the custody of the Romans, yeah, the Jewish powers that be hated him, but a lot of Jews didn't. And they're looking at this as an unlawful detainment, another example of Roman injustice. That was adding fuel to that fire as well. So let's look at what Luke has to say. So we're starting in in Acts 25, in the first verse. Now when Festus had come up to the province, after 3 days he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Then the high priest and the chief men of the Jews informed him against Paul, and they petitioned him, asking a favor against him, that he would summon him to Jerusalem, while they lay in ambush along the road to kill him. But Festus answered that Paul would be kept in Caesarea, and that he himself would be going there shortly. Therefore, he said, let those who have authority among you go down with me and accuse this man to see if there's any fault in him. And when he had remained among them more than 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day, sitting on the judgment seat, he commanded Paul to be brought. When he had come, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood about and laid many serious complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. While he answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I offended in anything at all. But Festus, wanting to do the Jews a favor, answered Paul and said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and there be judged before me concerning these things? So Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you very well know. For if I am an offender or have committed anything deserving death, I do not object to dying. But if there is nothing in these things of which these men accuse me, no one can deliver me to them. I appeal to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, you have appealed to Caesar you shall go. So let's stop there. Okay, so after arriving, Festus spent 3 days kind of to settle in at Caesarea, which was the provincial capital. And then he went to Jerusalem basically to pay a courtesy call on the Jewish leadership. It was just a normal traditional thing to do. And these guys lost no time in bringing up Paul. I mean, he's here to say hi and let's get to know one another. And they're saying, hi, oh, by the way, we got this fellow we want you to deal with now. Instantly. And there was a new high priest at this point, a Herod Agrippa, who is someone we're going to meet in a little while, had the power to appoint the high priest. And again, we'll talk about that later. He kicked out Ananias and threw in this new guy named Ishmael. The Bible doesn't tell us this, but the records do show this. However, Ananias is still the power behind the throne. So he prodded Ishmael pretty quickly. You need to talk about this Paul with this Festus guy. We need to make sure that Paul is taken care of and taken care of now. Okay? So Festus is there. He's talking to it. Ishmael saying, yeah, there's this guy we want you to deal with. And you get the impression that Felix did not thoroughly debrief Festus as to what was happening with Paul. Because it seems like Festus is pretty ignorant about what's been going on. It seems that he didn't know anything about the original plot. There was a reason why Paul was in Caesarea. It was because they were going to kill him. And so the centurion, remember, Claudius sent him up to Festus. Festus read the report and said, yeah, you're here. This is safe. And didn't even think about handing him back over to the Jews. I will say that for him. And he didn't, he didn't seem to think that the Jews were out for blood. Okay, you've got this question of your law. What's the big hurry? I think that's kind of what Festus's opinion is. What's the big hurry? And, I guess I shouldn't be too surprised that Felix didn't have a longer conversation. Governor of Judea was not a coveted post among Roman officials. And I'm sure Felix, once he got the recall to go to Rome, was ready to leave at a moment's notice. And I'm sure at their meeting it was more like, Festus says, you are relieved. Felix says, I am relieved. Goodbye. And boom, he's gone. Didn't have a chance to really brief him on anything. So that left Festus at a disadvantage, through no fault of his own. And being a Roman, he could transfer the courtroom proceedings to Jerusalem, and as well as have him in Caesarea. That'd be normal. And I think the Jews were in their minds thinking, he'll do this. He just doesn't seem to know anything about what happened. So he's not going to send a large number of troops to guard Paul, and probably 2 or 3 maybe. One's going to be chained to him, and then 2 or 3 others just kind of come out. So this would be easy pickings for an ambush. Okay? And it's interesting. It's moved from outsiders going, these 40 guys wanting to kill Paul, to now the council itself deciding, that's a great idea. Let's do it ourselves. And, Festus looked at it. This is a question of Jewish law. Yeah, sure. We could do it in Jerusalem. And again, I think he didn't see or was totally unaware, and I think it was because no one told him, of just how much the Jews hated Paul. I mean, talk about holding a grudge for 2 years. Okay? I mean, kill Paul had been their rallying cry ever since Paul showed up. And Paul knew it. He himself knew it. And I also gathered maybe that Paul didn't talk to Festus either. There was obviously a breakdown in communication. Now, Paul knew this, and he knew that the Lord was going to protect him, because the Lord says, you're going to go to Jerusalem, or you're going to go to Rome. And he was banking on that promise. Okay, I'm going to go to Rome. So therefore, what am I worried about? But he doesn't, Paul is just kind of hoping, at this point, I think Paul's just waiting for the Lord to work in some way, shape, or form. But I think the Jews were saying, we got this ignorant governor here. Let's take advantage of that. However, the ignorant governor was thinking about his own convenience. And so he decided, no, we're not going to go. I'm not going to bring him down to Caesarea. There's no point in bringing him to Jerusalem. There's no point in going to Jerusalem. He's in Caesarea. You want to try him, you come up here and do it. And I'm wondering just what they felt about that. Is just like, oh, I guess we can't try to assassinate them. All right, what's plan B? Well, let's go up to Caesarea. Let's do what we did before. And so, after a few days, Festus goes back into Caesarea. The Jewish leaders go back as well. Okay? And now I think they're banking, well, let's hope the guy, we give a good enough impression that he's going to hand him over to us, and then we can kill Paul, and that's the end of it. Now, they get there. This time they don't have an attorney. Remember last time they had Tertullus, who was basically an orator, and he was an attorney familiar with Roman law. This time they just basically said, well, he did this, he did that, he did the other, and da-da-da-da-da, but they didn't produce any witnesses. They didn't have any proof. And Paul basically stood up and said, I didn't do anything. And I like the way Luke just kind of glosses through this. I did nothing. I did nothing against the Jews. I did nothing against the temple. I did not break Roman law. And Festus is thinking, yeah, no, he's got a point. Doesn't seem like this is going anywhere. So he's thinking, okay, maybe we should have this in Jerusalem. Maybe the Jews will bring some further proofs, because he said, I can watch over this, and let's move the venue to Jerusalem. And it was a favor. He was trying to please the Jews. Remember his original orders: don't cause any trouble. So he's trying to keep the Jews happy. And again, I don't think he knew that doing this would essentially be a death sentence for Paul, but he could not do that without Paul's permission. Another one of those perks of Roman citizenship. Even though he was governor, Paul had to agree to go back to Jerusalem. And Paul basically said, no, I am not going. Because it's like, first off, I'm not going to get a fair trial there anyway. Secondly, this would put me in jeopardy. Yeah, the Lord's going to protect me. And this is something a lot of people are saying, well, he's showing lack of faith. No, he's just being wise. Many of you heard me back during the COVID thing that we should never be fearful of COVID. Lord's going to protect us, but doesn't mean we go into a ward full of people who are with COVID and just sit there and without a mask or any protection and just walk around there and say, hey, I'm okay. The Lord's going to protect me. He's not going to do that. Some people, it's like, Satan tempting Jesus from the temple. Oh yeah, if you do this or if you do that, if you throw yourself from the top of the temple, it says in the Bible, it says that God will protect you and not cause you to dash your foot against a stone. And the response was, don't tempt God. And that's essentially what is happening here. Paul knows that God's going to protect him, but he also knows that I'm not going to go willing into danger to prove a point. And he's essentially saying, Jerusalem's not where I want to go anyway. And so he basically says to Festus, I am standing before Caesar's court. This is where I'm supposed to be. I am a Roman citizen. But he wasn't sure what Festus would do. He didn't know the guy any more than the Jews did. Festus could still say, well, he might have to do this. So Paul says, okay, and if that's the case, then I appeal to Caesar. Okay? Now, Roman law at this time, in certain situations, protected its citizens with this right of appealing to the emperor. And basically what it was is it happened in special cases. It didn't happen every time. But in special cases, and this was one of those cases where what was going on was beyond the authority of the local governor. Basically, and I'll read this to you, it's where the threat of violence or violent coercion or capital punishment by provincial administrators was present. And this was definitely the case. Even though Festus was governor, when it came to Jewish law, the Jews actually trumped the Romans. And Paul was in danger of the death penalty, according to Jewish law, since they accused him of profaning the temple. Now again, it was not a case of he did it, he didn't. But he wasn't going to get a fair trial. They wanted to kill him. They were going to railroad him to his death. And they knew this was the way to do it. And Paul was aware of it as well. And so he figured, why not just play my last trump card? Now, it might seem a little odd that Paul would appeal to Nero, being the infamous persecutor of Christians at Rome. But remember what we said earlier, that at this point in his reign, Nero wasn't this crazed lunatic. it was actually considered something of a golden age because he was influenced by two people in particular. One was his former tutor when he was younger, a Stoic philosopher by the name of Seneca. I won't talk about him. We don't have time. And the prefect of his Praetorian Guard, Burrus, they actually helped keep Nero on the straight and narrow. And what he did is he was trying to basically make a name for himself. He was the last of his family to be emperor at this point because he didn't have an heir. And he wanted to build up Rome. He wanted to kind of return Rome to a type of glory. Now, in AD 68, Nero committed suicide because he'd basically been dethroned because of all the nonsense that he did. I mean, the guy did turn totally whacked at the end of his reign. So a lot of historians tend to demonize him and say, oh yeah, he was always horrible, he was always a tyrant, and so forth. And this wasn't really true. He built a lot of stuff for the population in Rome. Now, here's a good example of how history says when Rome was burning, supposedly he was playing a violin and laughing. That wasn't true. For one thing, there were no violins in ancient Rome. Okay? And secondly, when the fire was put out, he opened up his own palace and his own grounds to the homeless and paid out of his own pocket to rebuild the city. That's not someone who is, this, homicidal maniac. Not yet, anyway. Later he becomes this. Okay? Within about, like I said, when the Jews started rebelling in AD 66, that's when it all started going downhill. Okay, and the Christians unfortunately got caught up in caught in the crossfire when this happened. So at this point, there's nothing to show just how crazy Nero was. So Paul, to him, is like this is a reasonable risk. He wasn't, and as it turns out, he was right. At that point, Nero did not condemn him to death, but released him. And he knew that once I appealed to Caesar, the Jews can't touch me. This was not a spontaneous act on Paul's part. This was not an act of desperation. I think he figured if this keeps going, I think he was tired. I've been in here for 2 years. Yes, it's comfortable. Yes, it's nice and well treated. But I'm supposed to be in Rome, and I'm doing nothing. So he decided to take the cards. I'm going to do it my own way. I'm going to go to Rome, and I don't, why would I go to Jerusalem? I'm not going to get a fair shake down there. And so this forced the Romans' hands. And the Jews, I don't know if they realized that Paul could do this or not. I'm pretty certain they knew that Paul was a Roman citizen. Citizenship among the Jews was not the rule, but it was hardly unheard of. A lot of people had Roman citizenship for one reason or another who were Jewish and who were actually Pharisees or Sadducees. Okay? So they probably knew he was Jewish, but I don't think they thought he would do that. I think they figured he was probably going to say, okay, yeah, we'll do this way. Or he'll fight it out or something, I think that really they were just thinking he'll just roll over and we can have our way with him. But Paul said, no. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to go. So Festus, it says he's talking to his council. He's not talking to the Jewish council. He's talking to his own advisors. He was trying to determine whether the appeal was actually valid. Because again, it was under certain conditions. Okay? And he also was wondering, if he appealed, but he's clearly innocent. I think Festus saw that. He's clearly innocent. But should I just go ahead and acquit him right here and just let him free so the appeal is unnecessary? I'm sure he was talking to some of his advisors who were probably much more knowledgeable of what was happening in Judea. And definitely, as we said, with him being on, if the Jews tried him, it was a capital penalty if they convicted him. So it's like, the appeal to Caesar qualifies here. And should I acquit him? Well, again, if he did, he'd be very unpopular among the Jews, and at this point in time, he didn't want to do that. So basically he said, okay, let's go ahead. You two want to go to Caesar you shall go. And basically it was a political decision as opposed to a legal decision. This was a very nice and easy exit out of a very sticky situation. However, okay, we solved this problem. Now we still got to deal with the fact that this guy has no charges against him. And so he's saying, how can I transfer this guy to Rome? And obviously there's going to be a report that Nero's going to read. This guy claims for an appeal, and Nero's reading the thing. Well, he's appealing to me. What are the charges? Because he still doesn't have that. He never figured it out. What can I do? Well, fortunately, there was a welcome distraction in the form of a state visit from Herod Agrippa II and his sister Bernice, who came to welcome the new governor. So let's read about this in verse 13. So after some days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to greet Festus. When they had been there many days, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There's a certain man left a prisoner by Felix, about whom the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me when I was in Jerusalem, asking for a judgment against him. To them I answered, it is not the custom of the Romans to deliver any man to destruction before the accused meets the accuser face to face, and has opportunity to answer for himself concerning the charges against him. Therefore, when they came together without any delay, the next day I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought in. When the accusers stood up, they brought no accusation against him of such things as I supposed, but had some questions against him about their own religion, and about a certain Jesus who had died, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And because I was uncertain of such questions, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there be judged concerning these matters. But when Paul appealed to be reserved for the decision of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept till I could send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him. So Herod Agrippa II, okay, this is the first time we've seen this fellow. His full name was Marcus Julius Agrippa II. He was the son of Herod Agrippa, whom we saw earlier in chapter 12. He was the one who had put James to death and was going to put, the apostle James to death, and was going to put Peter to death, okay? Only an angel came and released Peter from the prison, and being angry about what happened, this Agrippa I went back to Caesarea, and then he had this long speech before a town that had previously been the enemies, and the people were screaming, "Oh, the voice of a God, not of a man," and he took it as like, "Yeah, I know, I'm wonderful." And the Lord struck him with worms, and the man died. Okay, so that's Herod Agrippa. That's Agrippa II's father, and then his grandfather was Herod the Great. Okay, the guy that tried to kill all the babies in Bethlehem. Okay? Now this Marcus Julius Agrippa, okay, he was brought up in Rome. Okay? He did not grow up in Judea. He was brought up in Rome in the court of Claudius, and like his father, became a favorite of the emperor. Now we remember his father died, had the worms. He died in 44, AD 44. And at that point, his son was only 17. He was not of the age of majority, so he couldn't take the throne yet. So what happened is that all of Judea that had previously been part of the kingdom was now placed directly under the Roman governor, whoever it was at that point in time. That would be Judea, Samaria, Galilee. And then Claudius appointed, because Claudius, again, they were good friends. They grew up together. Claudius appointed Agrippa II to be king of a small petty kingdom northeast of Judea somewhere. And then when Philip, which was another one of the Herods, died, he handed that territory over to Agrippa II. And then he was basically a king, but no longer a king in Judea. He was a king kind of the surrounding areas to the north and the east. So accompanying the king was his sister Bernice. Now his sister Bernice was about a year younger than Agrippa. Okay, she herself is an interesting character, though really very little of her history matters. But she had been, for example, engaged to the nephew of the philosopher Philo, who's, again, we're not going to get into him. But then she ended up marrying her uncle, who was another Herod. And when that man died, she came to live with her brother. Okay? Now, a lot of eyebrows were raised. Okay? Josephus, the great Jewish historian, mentions that he thinks that they were a couple, without going much further than that. And there was a lot of tongues wagging in Jerusalem about this. And it was a big deal because incest is definitely against the law of Moses. And this type of tomfoolery was also looked down upon by the Romans. That was a big no-no. Even a lot of the emperors pulled that stunt. It was still looked down. This is a big no-no. Because they talked about it in Rome as well. And nothing was, believe it or not, nothing was ever substantiated. Okay? People suspected, people thought it was probably true, but no one actually ever proved it. Doesn't really matter. So here's Agrippa. He's a kingdom outside of Judea, but even though he did not rule over Judea, Claudius gave him an interesting position as curator of the temple. Now, curator of the temple was he had the power to dispose and appoint the high priest. He had responsibility of preserving the temple treasury and the priestly vestments. And this is, interesting because if you recall, we talked about this back in Luke, that the Herods were not Jews. They were Edomites, or Idumeans as they called it back then. They were Edomites. And this had always been a point of contention between the Jewish people and these so-called kings. They didn't have a lot of respect for them, and it was really only the Romans being in the province that allowed these kings to rule as long as they did. But Agrippa, he seems to be an interesting fellow because he took his new duties as the curator of the temple seriously. He started studying the law. He got into it. He went out and talked to the different teachers. He was familiar with the Christians. He even talked with them. Whether he talked to Paul, I doubt it. It doesn't say he did. But he probably talked to some Christians to find out what their view was. And he became very much a authority on the Jewish religion to the Romans. And to be honest, a lot of the Jews said, yeah, this guy is pretty smart. He knows what the Jewish religion is, despite any questions about his moral character. Which, think about how many people know Christianity inside out, know the Bible backward and forward, but live like heathens. This is a good example of that. Okay? So, Festus talking about Paul with Agrippa was a natural consequence because he was aware, I'm sure, before he went back from Rome. Nero said, oh, by the way, when you get out there, look up Herod Agrippa II. He knows the Jews. He doesn't live in the area. He's a king outside the area, but he knows the Jews. Talk with him, and he'll give you some good advice. And so he took advantage of it. And Festus basically said, yeah, the Jewish case against Paul was a question of religion. It was not a case for the Roman law. It's not a case for civil law. There were religious questions. And sorry, as Romans, we don't handle those. And we know, because it says, but the book of Acts tells us, that Festus wanted to move the trial to Jerusalem to do the Jews a favor, but nobody would admit that. That's why Festus in verse 20 gave the impression that he wanted to move the trial to Jerusalem because of the Jewish questions that could only be settled by the Jewish people. That was a lie. A white lie, but it was still a lie nonetheless. He would never admit that he was trying to gain favor with the Jews by doing something. So he goes back. I don't know. He appeals to Caesar. He qualifies for the appeal, but the guy, I don't think he did anything wrong. Do you have any insight, Agrippa, of what I could do here? Okay. Now, to his credit, Agrippa basically said, You know what? I want to hear Paul myself. Then we can talk. I'm not going to give you my opinion now because I don't know enough. But yeah, can we arrange a meeting? Can we see him? And Festus says, sure, we'll do it tomorrow. He's here. We'll do it tomorrow. And an awful lot like a previous Herod, Antipas. Remember the one who was alive during Jesus' life? The one who put John the Baptist to death? It's almost the same. I'd like to hear these guys. Antipas wanted to hear Jesus. Agrippa wants to hear Paul. And there's a Roman governor more than happy to bring him together. In Jesus' case, it was Pilate. Paul's case, it was Festus. And basically, let's do this. Let's have a meeting. Let's talk. And guess what? We're going to deal with that next week because Paul's defense before Agrippa is the longest one recorded in the book of Acts. And I don't want to try to rush it in and finish it off. I want to stay, because we got communion today, I want to stay below my normal time limit and not run on about it. So personal lessons here is, well, be patient and use the governing authorities to your advantage. Okay? There are so many Christians out there that think that if you cooperate with the government in any way, shape, or form, you are compromising your faith. No, you're not. Okay? If someone has wronged you, okay, you have recourse through the government court system to right that wrong. Okay, now, if it's another Christian, you've got the church, but, if someone's accusing you of something, you are entitled to the defense of an attorney you hire, or if you can't afford an attorney, the state will hire one for you. Okay? You have the right as American citizens to vote. You have a right as American citizens to write to your governing authorities, whomever they may be. You have the right to show up at city and town council meetings. You have the right, if you really want to go up to Salt Lake and sit in on the legislature, both the Senate and the House. Okay? If you really are good at it, you can actually, after jumping through a few hoops, go to Washington, D.C. and do the same thing. Okay? We have that privilege. We have that right. Don't be afraid to use it. You may never have to. Okay? And of course, use it with discretion. Paul, you could see where Paul used each one of his rights, not all at once, but when it was to his advantage. Okay? He just didn't sit there and say, well, no, I'm going to have a hissy fit and I want to do all this together. No. He waited. No, I'm not going to go to Jerusalem. Okay. Well, what can we do? Well, I want to appeal to Caesar. Okay. Can we do this? Yeah, you can. All right. And it was not all happening at once. It wasn't out of desperation. It was, I know my rights. I know what God wants me to do. So I'm going to use my rights for God's glory. Freedom of speech is a wonderful thing. Use it to God's glory. Okay? And also remember, freedom of speech is a two-way street. One of the dangers, and I remind some of my more liberal friends of this, one of the dangers of freedom of speech is you're probably going to hear something you don't like. Well, guess what? That person that you don't agree with has just as much right to talk and make their opinion as you do. And you have no right to try to shut them down any more than he has a right to shut you down. Or as one politician, I forget who it was, but I remember this for years, was, I may not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. Which is true. They may be speaking stuff that's against what I believe, but that's freedom of speech. That's their right. So, we're going to move into communion now. So I'll go ahead and close this at this point. Father, we thank you again for the example of the Apostle Paul. We praise you that he was a great example for us on how to deal with the governing authorities. The model prisoner, basically. Someone who spoke up for his rights at the right time, but also cooperated with the governing authorities when it was right. He was always respectful. Yeah, at one point he kind of lashed out at the high priest, but he quickly apologized. He realized that he had lost it. But Father, for the most part, whenever we have dealings with the government, even if it's getting a building permit or something like that, to use that same patience that Paul showed, just put it into our hearts, Father. No one likes to run around any more than Paul did. But that's the way it works down here, Father, and you know it. We ask you, Father, just to be with us now as we go into our communion time. We ask you to give us that retrospect on what you did for us, that you died for us when we really didn't deserve it, simply because you loved us. Not only did you die, you rose again and allowed us now to become part of the body of Christ, to be with you forever when our time on this earth is over. The promise of salvation is so great that it gives us peace that the world can't understand. And we thank you for that, Father. So as we go through communion right now, help us to recognize what it really, being here, being a believer, is all about. We praise you and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.